came out of basically 10 years of work as a journalist, as well as for my academic training as well. So it was my master's and my PhD work that really went into the book. But the way that it had already been constructed was via columns that I had written for the Observer newspaper, which is part of the Guardian Media Group. So already I had kind of translated it, I suppose, for a public audience. And then in the process of re-editing each of the chapters into chapter length, and they're still pretty small, pretty short, but in the process of that, and working with my editor, I then had to strip out the academies even further. So there was a little bit of personal conflict in that, because I found that a little bit challenging to kind of deconstruct my academies and go back into the journalist. But in terms of the audience and the filters through which I was looking at this context, is I'm a social psychologist by training. I became interested in this area when I started to observe in my journalism work how people were importing themselves into this virtual environment. And so I suppose I entered the research for the book, and also for all of the other, with that already in mind. As a psychologist, looking at behavior, looking at influence and attitudes, and looking at the processes through which people express these motivations, these rituals, these identities. And then the challenge came in translating all of that for a general public. Frankly, I was quite lucky when I was doing my research, because although web research had been going for about, if I'm being liberal, I would say maybe 15 years. I was able to read pretty much everything that was out there at the time, and then to kind of condense it over this period. And so, I mean, that was a real benefit to the way that I chose to approach the book, which is basically consume everything. But yes, it was always the intention to kind of to take and digest relevant. Now, what I had hoped, and what I do hope, is that the book itself is as balanced as an academic would seek to make it. Let's just say that I'm more biased towards so attitudes about the web tend to kind of fall in a dystopian, utopian sort of perspective. And I would say that I try to be as middle of the road as possible, but I probably come across as more utopian. I don't like that because I like to think of myself as balanced, but more a sort of pragmatist. So if I was to kind of look at a percentage of my relationship with the content that I read to the content that actually came into the book, I would say that I'm probably sort of 60% utopian. And the reason for that is because I think it's really important to balance, but also to celebrate. I don't want people to think that this environment is something totally new and something totally different, but I also want to point out the places where it is. So. Funnily enough, just the other day I went and had breakfast with my supervisor, because I'm consulting with her and her team on a new research project that's looking at how hierarchies and existing social stigma is replicated and perpetuated online. They specifically use the example of the reality TV series Benefit Street, and they analyzed tweets in the week that program was broadcast on Channel 4. And what they identified was, in fact, that most of the people on Twitter, or a louder majority on Twitter, sort of perpetuated the stigmatic stereotype, the stereotype that people who are on benefits are lazy and, you know, sponging off the state. What is interesting about that is to attempt to extract the social media bias from the bias that was baked into the program. And I think when we look at the existing hierarchies and when we look at the replication of hierarchies and biases within social media, we have to remember that it comes within the context of a wider media. That example, I think, the Benefit Street example, kind of really drives that home. People were responding to a very public experience, and were in many ways reiterating the lens through which that the characters in the pantomime were being presented and were being portrayed. Existing hierarchies absolutely translate online. We are not in an environment in which we have any kind of non-gatekeeper scenario. Ever since, very, very early computer-mediated communication research, HCI research, people were recognizing that age, gender, location were all features and factors in how we interacted online. By, of course, bringing our existing stereotypes, by bringing our existing schema to bear upon our relationships online. So I think that's possibly why I write to that and how I write to that. There is one area of concern specifically about the online world that I highlight towards the end of the book, which has to do with sort of the potential danger of stereotypes echoing through the self-fulfilling prophecies and the kind of that confirmation bias that social media in particular can help to create. I had a really interesting discussion yesterday, for example, talking about the election, the forthcoming election in the UK. And this was for the Guardian's Tech Weekly podcast. And in the room, we had a social media expert, we had a news expert, that's my daughter, we had a social media expert, we had a news expert, and we had a politics expert. And the social media expert raised a very interesting point, and that is that different platforms themselves have political biases, having very much to do with the people who are on them. So Twitter, for example, leans more liberal. I didn't realize that, and I think that's an interesting area to explore, to understand. Absolutely. So I wrote one of my columns was about education, and when it came to actually what it was that went into the book, I had to kind of identify the areas. Education is a fascinating area because it has been one of the leaders, in the forefront of internet research, of social media research, and it changes so rapidly. In fact, so much of the book is, I would argue, already out of date. Here we go. We're going to have a cat-child interaction. That should be fun. Yeah, I mean, it just changes so rapidly. Spartacus, you're going to have to move, kiddo. The education space is very, very sophisticated when it comes to social media and when it comes to online. Partially, I think, because they've used it for such a long time. In terms of it, sorry, I'm going to have to move my cat because otherwise he's going to bite my child. We haven't yet done the full introduction. But in terms of the education space, there's so much research. But given that the emphasis, the focus of the book was on psychology, you can probably tell that the chapters that are in the book that are longer are those that have to do with psychology, as opposed to necessarily, say, politics, or, I did some on celebrity, some on news, but really there's not as much in those chapters because that's more sociology as opposed to psychology. And I would argue that education is the same. When I wrote when I wrote the column for The Observer about education, that was a comment that many people made, which was basically, well, but what about MOOCs and what about all this, what about how it's transforming the education landscape? And that's more a sociological observation than a psychological. I mean, I think it's difficult to rush in. I think it's foolhardy to rush in and to suggest that things have changed dramatically, because we have been around for a really long time without social media. Our basic psychologies, our basic urges and our impulses are very much the same. And I don't know how it will affect my my microphone hungry daughter. I don't know how it will affect her social world and her sort of psychological way of being. I'm not in child development, and so therefore I don't think that I wouldn't propose to suggest how it has changed and adjusted their way of being, children's way of being. But they will have a different way of interacting with one another and with us, because of the fact that these tools are now available. This palette is now available for them to express themselves. But we have to think about it in the same way as the telephone and the television and all other forms of media. Those were also a new way to express oneself. It's just that now they now have a different kind of pen. They now have a different kind of, a paintbrush with which to paint their world. And I'm really skeptical to say that, just because something's interactive means that it's changing our brains. I'm really skeptical to say that, because there's no evidence about that. My daughter, and I hate using examples like this, but my daughter is really interactive with books, right? A book is an interactive thing to her because she can turn the pages, right? We forget about that when we talk about, how much is changing for the young people. There's a really wonderful thing that Sonia Livingstone from the LSE talks about. She said, I'm really curious about the silences. Boredom is good. Having the quiet times as well as the active times is important for people, not just for children. And I think that that's something that we should be aware of as kids grow up. So conceptual communities is a really delightful and sort of postmodern, I suppose you could argue, concept that was introduced by Barry Wellman in Toronto. And the idea there is that people have communities that are not physically based. Now, before Irving Goffman, who's a sociologist in the 1960s, wrote about this concept of conceptual communities, there were a lot of people who thought that to be a community, you had to be in a physical location. I've never thought that. Literally, even when I was a kid, I never thought that. Perhaps by the very nature of the fact that I literally moved every 4 years of my life, I've never thought that I am bound by a physical location. So this idea of conceptual communities, that people can find their people, all of that, totally fit with my existing schema. When it comes to trolling and it comes to bad behavior, one of the things that I raise is that this notion of de-individuation, this concept of people's bad behavior because they are anonymized, I think it's a red herring. To suggest that anonymity is the cause of bad behavior is to forget that anonymity can also be the cause of great joy and support and beauty. The conceptual communities that exist online and the cultures that exist online are such that many of them, certainly the popular ones that we hear about, and Gamergate is an example, they condone this kind of behavior. It's a straightforward social norm. It's okay to do this, and in fact it's encouraged, right? The book was published before Gamergate. I personally have been the recipient of some really beautiful threats and trolling in my time online. Hiya, you want to stand up, don't you? How are we going to do this? So I'm very there we go. So I'm very aware of the shortcomings, of the shortfalls of the online world for people's experiences, particularly sexism, you know, and then there's also a whole bunch of racism and really nasty stuff. But rather than blame the technology, I think it's much more important to actually use this as an opportunity to open up questions about our attitudes offline, right? We think sexism is okay. Hold on a second, is that right? Do we think sexism is okay? Or is this just something that's happening over there on the internet, and so therefore it's fine, we don't need to worry about it, you know, it's the technology's fault? And I don't actually believe that. Great question. Frankly, what we're dealing with is an evolving technology. The notion of distributed social networking, the notion of sort of I suppose in some ways kind of, what we're dealing with is, to go back, we're dealing with an evolving technology, and we are evolving with it. It is evolving with us. It's unsurprising because it's ultimately a device that we use to connect with one another. And we are human beings, and therefore we are the ones who sort of evolve it. And when you look at our approaches to how we identify communities and how we create communities, social networking is an absolutely ideal example of this. It's a form and a function that is unique to the web, but actually is very situated in how it is that we process our social worlds. We need to keep small categories. We need to keep to keep control and order of all of the information, all of the input that's coming in. So we do need to kind of keep close those people whom we feel to be part of our group. But in terms of the sort of the distributed aspect of it, I mean, it's really difficult. I don't like to predict the future. I hate predicting the future because I'm always wrong. I mean, ultimately, each of these is its own different platform, has its own different use. I mentioned earlier that, you know, the demographic of Twitter slants more liberal than other networks. You know, the demographic of Tumblr slants much younger than other networks. These systems, we will find the platform, we will find the technology that works for us, that works for the function of our communities. And I think that ultimately is its power. It's a relatively blank enough slate, relatively blank. It's not completely blank. They do have some form and function. They do have some hard-baked ideologies within them. But the technology is a relatively blank slate that we can form it as we go along. And in many ways, thankfully, that's how the developers are doing it as well. You know, the whole notion, the whole concept of agile publishing means that people are constantly changing and constantly evolving to work with the audience that they have, that they've already got, or that they also wish to work with. There are times in which okay, I'll give another example from yesterday. The politicians who are currently running for office are they have to do three things now. The first thing that they have to pour money into is face-to-face time, knocking on doors, kissing babies, shaking hands, right? The second thing that they have to pour money into is their national campaign that offers the kind of party line as to what it is that they believe in, right? That doesn't necessarily, that's a different kind of effectiveness for the handshaking, kissing babies, right? Because that's a very personal, that's about sort of reputation and trust. But now they've also got to go into social networking and distributed networks and distributed communities and be present there because that's another kind of reputation management. You know, it's even more individual and even more long term. I would say that yes, I would say it's a new trend, and I would also say it's a new job that
that not just politicians have to use, but also, you know, authors have to use, students have to use, CEOs have to use. They have to be present in this space. If they're not, even if, you know, their videos only get 1,000 views, or, you know, their podcasts only get 20 people listening to them, then somebody can turn around and say, hold on a second, you're not using this platform. So I think that obviously we're negotiating and we're trying to figure out what the different ways, what the different uses of this relatively open space are, this relatively unformed space are. And that, I mean, we'll see how it evolves. So I think I don't think I would change anything about the trolling and the bullying chapter, because what you could do is you could identify individual case studies, but what I'm still trying to do within the book is look at general trends and look at psychological principles and look at what we knew before the web and what we know, you know, what behavior is happening after the web, and comparing that. So I wouldn't change that one. I might write one about gender. I suppose that could probably go into identity. Definitely wouldn't change the identity chapter, because that's very, very consistent. I would put more in about the responsibility of developers, and the ethics of the platforms that they're building. That's something that I've always been very, very interested in, but frankly had absolutely no idea how I was going to translate for the general public. Thankfully, we did that in a radio program called The Digital Human. This last series, the last episode, was on ethics. And so now I figure I have an in. I have a way to get in to kind of make it more palatable to people. That actually is mostly what I'm working on, is I'm working on radio programs that are sort of continuing the themes of what was in the book. It's called, the radio series that I do is called The Digital Human, and I like to think of it as more about the human than about the digital. It just so happens that we're living in a world in which things are digital. So that's that. But primarily my work right now is about using a very, very old-fashioned technology, radio, to really explore the thesis that I seem to have identified, that I seem to have found for myself, which is technology isn't going to bite you. You know, respect one another, and don't blame the technology for your own shortfalls.